Tell everyone the wedding is over. The text flashed on the screen like a blade. The groom was gone. The bride was still standing at the altar, radiant in white, unaware of the storm. 200 guests began to whisper. The bride's father looked around the chapel, his face pale, lost for words. At the back of the church, the groom's brother, a single father, read the message again. His brother had run away. The bride was about to be abandoned in front of everyone. He looked at his daughter, holding his hand. Then he stood up. He walked toward the front, and he said one thing. That changed everything. The St. Jude Chapel on the outskirts of Chicago was a place of history and elegance. The air inside was thick with the heavy scent of Casablanca lilies and the soft, flickering warmth of 1,000 white candles. It was supposed to be the most perfect day in the life of Sophie Langford. She stood at the front of the sanctuary, a vision in delicate Alençon lace, her long veil spilling over the marble steps like a frozen waterfall. At 28, Sophie was the woman every man in the city wanted to marry, kind, brilliant, and breathtakingly beautiful. But as the heavy oak clock on the wall struck 2:30 p.m., the perfection began to crack. The ceremony was supposed to have started 30 minutes ago. The organist had played the processional 3 times already. Each time the music swelled, the guests craned their necks toward the back door, expecting to see the groom, Ryan Carter. And each time the door remained closed. The silence that followed was no longer respectful. It was heavy with a growing, suffocating dread. Sophie's father, a man who had built a business empire from nothing, was now looking like a ghost. He paced the small area near the front pews, his hands trembling as he checked his gold watch for the 20th time. He looked at his daughter, who was still standing tall, her eyes fixed on the entrance with a desperate, heartbreaking hope. In the very last row, sitting in the shadows, was Daniel Carter. Daniel was 35 years old, the older brother of the missing groom. He sat stiffly in a black suit that felt too tight for his broad shoulders. Beside him was Lily, his 7-year-old daughter. Lily was dressed in a soft pink flower girl dress, her small fingers twisting a stray ribbon. Daniel was a man who knew everything about responsibility because he had spent the last 3 years being a single father. When Daniel's wife had left him 3 years ago, she didn't just leave a marriage, she left a child. Daniel had learned the hard way that love is not about the grand speeches made at a wedding. It's about who shows up at 3 a.m. when the fever is high and the world is dark. He had raised Lily alone, balancing a demanding career in structural engineering with the delicate task of being both mother and father. He was a rock, steady, silent, and deeply protective. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. It felt like a hornet sting. He pulled it out, and the light from the screen reflected in his dark, weary eyes. It was a message from Ryan. "I can't do it, Dan. I'm already 20 miles outside the city. I'm not built for this. I'm not built for forever. Tell Sophie the wedding is over. Tell her I'm sorry. I just can't be the man she needs." Daniel felt a surge of white-hot rage. He looked up at the altar. He saw Sophie. She looked so small against the backdrop of the massive church. She was about to be humiliated in front of 200 of the most influential people in Chicago. Ryan wasn't just breaking a heart. He was destroying a woman's dignity. Daniel looked at his brother's words again. Tell her the wedding is over. Daniel had spent his whole life cleaning up Ryan's messes. When they were kids, it was broken windows. When they were in college, it was gambling debts. Ryan was the charming one, the golden boy who could fly away whenever things got difficult because he knew Daniel would always be there to catch the debris. But this was too much. This was a human being's life. Daniel looked down at Lily. She was looking at Sophie with a sullen, confused expression. "Daddy," Lily whispered, her voice echoing in the silent chapel. "Why is Sophie crying? Is Uncle Ryan lost?" Daniel realized then that if he didn't do something, the memory of this day would be a scar that Sophie would carry forever. He saw the guests starting to stand up. He saw the pity in their eyes. Pity was a poison. He wouldn't let her be a victim. Daniel stood up. His heart was hammering like a trapped bird against his ribs. He squeezed Lily's hand, a silent promise to himself and to her. He stepped out into the center aisle. Every head turned. The whispers died down as the older, quieter Carter brother began to walk toward the altar. He didn't look like a man delivering bad news. He looked like a man going to war. He reached the front. He stood before Sophie's father and then turned to face the woman in the white dress. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling. "Daniel," she whispered. "Where is he? Tell me he's okay." Daniel took a deep breath. He didn't look at the crowd. He only looked at her. "He's okay, Sophie," Daniel said, his voice low and steady. "But he is a coward. He's gone. He's not coming." The gasp from the congregation was like a single collective intake of breath. Sophie's father moved to grab Daniel's collar, but Daniel didn't flinch. He looked Sophie in the eyes. He saw the world ending in her gaze. And then Daniel did the unthinkable. The chaos that erupted in the St. Jude Chapel was instantaneous. Sophie's mother fainted into the arms of a bridesmaid. Her father was shouting, demanding that Daniel tell him exactly where Ryan was so he could bring him back in chains. The guests were now standing, some of them already on their phones, the news of the abandoned bride spreading through social media like a wildfire. In the center of the storm stood Sophie. She didn't move. She didn't scream. She simply stood there as the reality washed over her. She was the most talked about bride of the season, and she had just been discarded like yesterday's news. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "He really left? Just like that? After 3 years?" Daniel stepped closer to her, ignoring the shouting men and the crying women. He looked at her with a clarity that no one else in the room possessed. "He left because he is a boy, Sophie, and you were always too much for him. You were a mountain he didn't have the courage to climb." Daniel felt a deep, familiar ache in his chest. He had watched Sophie and Ryan for 3 years. He had seen the way Sophie had supported Ryan's failing business ventures. He had seen the way she had been a friend to Lily when Daniel was at his lowest. Daniel had always kept his feelings in a box, locked away in the back of his mind. Ryan was his brother. Sophie was off limits. But seeing her now, broken and bleeding emotionally in front of a crowd of strangers, the lock on that box snapped. "I won't let them do this to you," Daniel said. Sophie looked at the guests. She saw the pity. She saw the cameras. "It's too late, Daniel. The wedding is over. I'm a joke now." Daniel turned to face the congregation. He didn't have a microphone, but his voice was trained to command construction sites and boardrooms. It filled the chapel, silencing the whispers. "Listen to me," Daniel shouted. The room went still. "My brother has left. He has proven today that he is not a man of honor. He has proven that he does not deserve the name Carter, and he certainly does not deserve this woman." Daniel turned back to Sophie. He reached out and took her hands. They were ice cold. "Sophie, you came here today to join a family. You came here to start a life. You did your part. You showed up. You kept your promise." Daniel looked down at Lily, who was standing right beside him, clutching her small rose. Then he looked back at Sophie. "Ryan is gone, but I am here, and Lily is here." Daniel took a step forward, closing the space between them. He lowered his voice so only she could hear, but his words were like thunder in the small space between them. "I have loved you in silence for 2 years, Sophie. I watched my brother treat you like an accessory, and it nearly killed me. I'm not Ryan. I don't run. I don't break promises. If you want to walk out of this church with your head held high, if you want to show them that today is still a beginning, then marry me." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. This was the silence of a world stopping on its axis. Sophie's father stopped shouting. He looked at Daniel. He knew Daniel. He knew Daniel's character. He knew that Daniel was the one who had actually handled the contracts for the wedding. Daniel was the one who had made sure the flowers were right. Daniel was the one who had comforted Sophie when Ryan forgot their anniversary. "Daniel?" Sophie's father asked, his voice cracking. "Are you serious?" "I have never been more serious in my life," Daniel said, his eyes never leaving Sophie's. "I have a license. I have a ring. I have a life that is ready for you. We don't have to be a perfect couple today. We just have to be a family that doesn't break." Sophie looked at Daniel. She saw the man who had always been in the background. She saw the man who had stayed up late to help her with her charity gala when Ryan was out drinking. She saw the father who looked at his daughter with a devotion that was holy. She looked at the guests. She saw their faces, shocked, expectant, hungry for drama. Then she looked at Lily. The little girl reached out and touched the lace of Sophie's sleeve. "Please don't be petty, Sophie," Lily said. "We can be your family." Sophie felt something shift inside her. The betrayal of Ryan was still there, a jagged wound in her heart. But Daniel's offer was a shield. He was offering her his name, his protection, and his life just to save her from the shame his brother had caused. She looked into Daniel's eyes. She saw no pity there, only a fierce, unwavering respect. "Daniel," she whispered, "you would do this? For me?" "I would do anything for you," Daniel replied. Sophie took a deep breath. She looked at the priest, who was standing with his mouth open. She looked at her father. "Do it," her father said, his voice a low growl of approval. "Marry a real man, Sophie." Sophie turned back to Daniel. She squeezed his hands. Her grip was strong now. "Daniel Carter," she said, her voice ringing out through the chapel. "I came here to marry a Carter, and I think I finally found the right one." The murmurs in the crowd turned into a roar. Daniel didn't wait. He looked at the priest. "Continue the ceremony," Daniel commanded. And as the music began to play again, the world watched as a single father did the unthinkable to save the woman he had always loved from the shadows. The ceremony that followed was nothing like the one that had been rehearsed. There were no teleprompters for these vows. There were no pre-written speeches about young love or fairy tales. The atmosphere in the chapel had shifted from a choreographed event to something raw, primitive, and deeply moving. The guests were leaning forward in their seats, their phones forgotten as they witnessed something that felt more like a holy covenant than a social contract. Daniel stood at the altar, his feet planted firmly. He didn't look like a groom who was nervous. He looked like a man who had finally come home. The priest, a man who had seen 40 years of weddings, was visibly shaken. He cleared his throat, his hands trembling as he turned the pages of his book. "We are gathered here in a way we did not expect," the priest began. "But perhaps we are gathered here in the way we were always meant to be." Daniel spoke first. He didn't look at the priest. He looked at Sophie. He didn't need a script. "Sophie," Daniel said, his voice resonating through the stone walls, "I have watched you from the sidelines for 3 years. I have seen your strength, your grace, and your capacity to love people who didn't always know how to love you back. Today, my brother did something unforgivable. He walked away from a treasure he didn't deserve. But I am a man who knows the value of what I have. I promise you today that I will be the man who stays. I will be the one who stands between you and the world. I will be the father who raises our children with the same honor I raise Lily. I give you my name, my life, and every breath I have left." Sophie's tears were no longer tears of shame. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming release. She looked at the man standing before her. For years, she had felt a strange, quiet comfort whenever Daniel was in the room. She had told herself it was just because he was the stable brother. But now, standing here, she realized it was because he was the only one who truly saw her. "Daniel," Sophie said, her voice gaining a strength that surprised everyone. "Today, I lost a dream I thought I wanted, but I found a reality I never knew I needed. You didn't just save me from a bad day, you saved me from a life of being second best. I take you as my husband, not out of desperation, but out of a sudden, clear realization that you are the only man who has ever truly shown up for me. I promise to be a mother to Lily. I promise to build a house with you that no storm can knock down. I am proud to be your wife." When Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, the same ring Ryan had bought, but now imbued with a completely different meaning, the chapel went silent. It was a silence of profound respect. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the priest said. Daniel leaned in. The kiss was not the tentative, performative kiss of a typical wedding. It was a seal. It was a promise of protection. When they pulled apart, Lily was right there between them. She reached up and grabbed both their hands. The walk back down the aisle was the most viral moment in the history of the city. As they stepped through the heavy oak doors and into the bright Chicago sun, the paparazzi who had been tipped off about the missing groom were stunned to see Sophie radiant, smiling, and walking hand in hand with Daniel. The reception that followed was a blur of high emotion. People weren't talking about the flowers or the food. They were talking about Daniel. They were talking about the single father who had stepped into the fire to save a bride. But for Daniel and Sophie, the real work was just beginning. That night, after the last guest had left and the last candle had been extinguished, they returned to Daniel's house. It was a comfortable home, but it was a home built for a man and a child. There were Lego bricks on the rug and a half-finished drawing of a sun on the kitchen table. Sophie sat on the edge of the sofa, still in her wedding dress. She looked around the room. It was so different from the sterile, high-end apartment she had shared with Ryan. This house felt lived in. It felt safe. Daniel came into the room having tucked Lily into bed. He had taken off his jacket and loosened his tie. He looked at Sophie, and for a moment the gravity of what they had done hit him. "Sophie," Daniel said, standing by the door, "I want you to know something. I meant every word I said in that church. But I also know that today was a trauma. You don't have to be my wife in the traditional sense tonight. We have time. We have all the time in the world. This house is yours. I'll sleep in the guest room. I just wanted you to be safe." Sophie looked at him. She saw the man who was still protecting her, even now when the cameras were off and the audience was gone. "Daniel," she said, standing up. The silk of her dress rustled in the quiet room. "You have been the only real thing in my life for a long time. I don't want to hide in a guest room. I want to start our life." But the peace didn't last long. The next morning, the doorbell rang. It was Ryan. He was disheveled, his eyes red from driving all night. He looked at the house, then he looked at Daniel, who opened the door with a cold, hard expression. "Dan," Ryan stammered. I made a mistake. I panicked. I'm back. I'm ready to talk to Sophie. I'm ready to make it right." Daniel didn't move. He stood in the doorway, a wall of muscle and conviction. "It's too late, Ryan," Daniel said, his voice like grinding stones. "What do you mean too late?" Ryan laughed nervously. "It's been 18 hours. She'll forgive me. She always does." "She's not your fiancée anymore, Ryan," Daniel said. "She's my wife. We were married yesterday at 3 p.m. in the church you abandoned, in front of the people you insulted." Ryan's face went white. You did what? You stole my wife?" "I didn't steal anything," Daniel replied. "I picked up what you threw away. Now get off my porch. If you ever come near her again, or near my daughter, you'll find out exactly what kind of man I am when I'm angry." Daniel closed the door. He turned to see Sophie standing in the hallway, Lily clutching her hand. Sophie looked at the door, then at Daniel. "He's gone," Daniel said. "I know," Sophie replied. "He was gone a long time ago. I just didn't see it until you showed me what a real man looks like." The months that followed the Carter wedding were a test of endurance. The media didn't let go easily. There were headlines in every tabloid, and Ryan didn't go away quietly. He tried to sue Daniel for emotional distress. He tried to claim that the marriage was a sham for financial gain. But every time Ryan struck, Daniel stood like a fortress. Daniel's life had always been about structure. He was a structural engineer. He understood that a building is only as strong as its foundation. And he spent every day building a foundation for Sophie and Lily. He didn't just give Sophie a house, he gave her a voice. He encouraged her to go back to school or her MBA, something Ryan had always discouraged because he wanted her to be very available for his social events. Daniel became the one who handled the house, the one who made the lunches, the one who cheered the loudest at Lily's soccer games. Sophie, in turn, became the missing piece of their puzzle. She brought a warmth to the house that Daniel hadn't realized was missing. She organized the chaos. She taught Lily how to paint and how to speak up for herself. One evening, about 6 months into the marriage, Daniel found Sophie in the backyard. She was sitting on the porch swing, looking at the stars. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked, sitting beside her poem. "I was thinking about that day at the church," Sophie said. "I used to think that was the worst day of my life, but now I think it was the best. If Ryan hadn't left, I would have spent 50 years being half-loved. I would have never known what it felt like to be someone's first choice." Daniel took her hand. "You were always my first choice, Sophie. I just thought I was too late." "You were right on time," she whispered. But the real test came when Lily got sick. It was a severe case of pneumonia that landed her in the hospital for 2 weeks. Daniel was a wreck. He sat by her bed, barely eating, barely sleeping. The old trauma of his wife leaving him made him terrified of losing the only other person he loved. Sophie was the one who held him together. She stayed in the hospital room every night. She talked to the doctors. She made sure Daniel ate. She was the anchor in the storm. When Lily finally recovered and was ready to go home, she looked at Sophie and said the words Daniel had been waiting to hear for years. "I love you, Mom." Daniel looked at Sophie. They both had tears in their eyes. The unthinkable act that Daniel had performed on a whim of honor had turned into a reality of deep, abiding love. Ryan eventually moved to another state, his reputation ruined and his money spent on lawyers. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale that the Carter family spoke of only in whispers. Daniel and Sophie's marriage wasn't built on a fairy tale. It was built on the ruins of a betrayal. But because of that, it was unbreakable. 1 year after the wedding at St. Jude, Daniel took Sophie back to the chapel. It was quiet this time. No guests, no cameras, no flowers. Just the two of them and Lily. "Why are we here, Daniel?" Sophie asked as they stood on the marble steps where her life had changed. Daniel took a small velvet box out of his pocket. Inside was a new ring, a ring he had designed himself. It wasn't as large as the one Ryan had bought, but it was made of solid platinum with a sapphire in the center, the color of Sophie's eyes. "A year ago, I married you to save you," Daniel said. "Today, I want to marry you because I love you. I want to make vows that aren't about a crisis. I want to make vows about the future." Daniel knelt on one knee. Lily stood beside him, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. "Sophie Carter," Daniel said, "will you stay with me? Will you be the mother of the children we haven't had yet? Will you be the woman I grow old with?" Sophie didn't hesitate. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They didn't need a priest this time. They had each other. The camera pans out as Daniel, Sophie, and Lily walk out of the chapel. They are laughing, the sound echoing through the quiet graveyard and the trees. They get into Daniel's old, reliable SUV. As they drive away, you can see the bumper sticker Lily had put on the back. "Best family ever." The screen fades to black with a final thought. Sometimes the person who breaks your heart is just the one clearing the way for the person who will heal it. Daniel didn't just save a wedding, he saved a woman's faith in humanity. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in second chances. And subscribe for more Iron Dad stories.